This is my fourth YouTube part about my experience growing up in the 2x2 church and then in the ministry for almost 26 years. And then now moving on to the next chapter of my life. Just sharing about my experience, sharing excerpts from the book I'm writing about my experiences in my life. Ultimately, bottom line, my focus, I always want to be and end with, start with, let love lead. Because Jesus is the most inspiring person to me, and he's my hero. So, all the years I preached the gospel, even though it was in a high control religion with things I look at now and I see that were false. And actually there was a lot of spiritual abuse amongst other things that I experienced. And anyway, so I looked at what I shared in the first three videos I did. And so I'm just going to kind of go from there on sharing some things and my thoughts. So this was just, I guess, earlier this month, I had this thought. And it was this. And it was when I was writing my journal, it just kind of came to me. And I wrote down this. I tried so hard to love in the work, or when I was in the ministry, many years, I tried so hard to love in the work without letting myself be loved the way God made me to be loved. Because what I have discovered now, since the last video I made, I got married on July 15th. And July 15th, 1996 was the very day I started in the work. And it just so worked out that was the day that worked best for us to get married. And I thought, wow, isn't that amazing? Because it's like it started this whole new chapter in my life where I feel free to love like I've never felt so free to love. And I feel so loved like I never felt loved before. Not that people didn't love me, I'm not saying that. But I can be loved the way God made me to be loved. And that's with a wife, with a companion, with a best friend, with a soulmate by my side that I can share everything with. And now one thing I say to people is, wow, now I feel complete. I'm like, well, no wonder. When God created Adam, what was the first thing he did? He said, he's not complete. So then he created Eve so Adam could have a helper. It completed him. And being incomplete like that, because I was reading a verse today in Matthew 15, verse 9, where Jesus said, beware that you don't teach for doctrine. You don't teach for doctrine the traditions of men. And there was a tradition in the 2x2 church that the ministry should be single. Now, there was instances where there were some workers that were married. But, like, minuscule instances. And it was understood when we went in the work, we couldn't get married. And if you were going to get married, you had to leave the work. And when it's been brought up, even as recently as within the last 2 years, I remember it being brought up in a workers' meeting. It was scoffed at by one of the overseers about that. And it's just, so it's like this doctrine, and that's a false doctrine. And so what happens is, we never can let ourselves be truly loved the way we need to be loved, the way we were made to be loved. And now that I feel complete with a wife who's my best friend and can share everything with, I just feel free to completely love like never before, because I'm loved the way I was made to be loved, in the right way. And I'm just so thankful for that. So then it says, Jesus says, this shall all men know you are my disciples, is your love for each other. And in the work, I saw a lot of harshness and fear and joy just getting sucked out of all of us workers. little by little by little. And then I thought of me at 15 years when things started going south for me. I made some bad choices and that I should not have made. And why? The joy had gotten sucked out of me. And I've seen that in many other workers, and then it deadens your spirit. And there's not a lot of life in the message. There's not a lot of, and then there's just focus on form and focus on the meetings and focus on, it's focus on man and focus on the ministry instead of Jesus. And then it's like, then you kind of start living for place and for pride and control and for meaning within this small group of people. It's not healthy. Well, anyway, so one letter I want to read to you that I wrote kind of helps explain where I am now and what I see and feel. I got a letter from what we would call a very faithful lady. And when I was a minister, I worked in her area for several years. And she's an elderly lady now. And I admire her. I admire her spirit. And she's one of the few people that has actually reached out to me and just asked me, instead of making up a narrative of what people think I'm thinking or what my experience might be, she's actually asked me. And I really, really, really appreciate that. And so I get this email from her, and then I wrote back, and then she wrote this email was in the middle of July. So what is it? End of October, almost November. And she said this. She says, I was glad to hear that you're feeling complete at this point. But she had asked me if I was continuing to go to meetings, which I wasn't at that time. And so she said, but I was surprised to hear that you're not going to meetings anymore. And she says, I'm not on any kind of social media. I just do old-fashioned email. She said, I do understand that. Having been in the ministry, you would have an inside perspective that my experience doesn't afford. I'm still in fellowship, and I do feel thankful for those in the ministry who still remain true to the direct teachings of Jesus. So here she was saying that the workers in the ministries are still staying true to the direct teachings of Jesus. And then she says, though it's been a grievous and shocking disappointment that some in the ministry have brought great harm to others, in my own journey, it is Jesus, the Son of God, and not man that my soul has been following all along. It was a lesson made clear to me after going through experiences in several religions. I'm so glad you still love the gospel and can hold in your heart getting to know Jesus through it and loving those who have loved you in his love. And then she wrote this. She says, I don't want to intrude upon your personal experience or pain that you've been healing from, but I want to ask, and she, in parentheses, she said, if you choose to answer, whether you think there is any reason why I should not be safe, why I would not be safe in continuing to worship in fellowship. I thought, well, that was like, I really appreciated her just asking. And then I was like, so it was July 20th, and then July, August, September. Oh, yeah, it was like 2.5 months. I kept thinking, I need to answer her. So finally I replied like 2.5 months later. And this was my reply. And I wrote to her, I just read again your email, and I am touched by your sensitivity towards me and your honesty about how you feel in your current situation in life. And then I wrote, I have been meaning to write back and answer your question. I do not believe, as you wrote, that the ministry is following the direct teachings of Jesus. Jesus did not command singleness, therefore celibacy, and the 2x2 commission from Matthew 10, when Jesus sent the apostles out 2 and 2. I said, and the 2x2 commission that included no extra clothes, shoes, etc. was for that immediate, urgent time that Jesus wanted them to prove that Jesus wanted them to pave the way with his message to the cities and towns and villages that he was to visit during his short time on earth. Then, in Acts, there are many examples of the gospel being shared in various ways and forms outside of the strict 2x2 commission in the Gospels while Jesus was alive. So, are you safe continuing to worship in the fellowship? This is a question I cannot answer for you. I can share the following with you that I believe and have experienced upon reflection. So I went on to write this. I feel and believe that I was indoctrinated from a child in ways that I felt we were the one true way. That we were the one true way and the workers were the one true ministry. What was the fruit of that in my life, and what have I observed in many other lives also? The fruit is isolation, self-righteousness, exclusivity, fear, conformity. So as a child, I said, I felt that this is what I was indoctrinated to believe, that we were the one true way and we had the one true ministry. And so the fruit is isolation, self-righteousness, exclusivity, fear, conformity. Then I wrote this. I have heard all my life phrases and truths such as the following. Oh, it's too bad they lost out. This fostered a judgment in my spirit and an attitude that all people were lost except professing people, which is the term that we used in the church, and they still use professing. And so that's what that fostered in us when we hear this phrase, oh, it's too bad they lost out. Someone that quit going to meetings and yeah, they lost out. It's too bad. Well, lost out from what? So where are they going? Yeah, they're not saved. That's what was being taught. Every other church was referred to as a false church. Again, this is a judgment that Jesus spoke against. That's a judgment Jesus spoke against. And like in Luke 9, verse 50, some of the disciples following Jesus, they criticized a man, or they asked about a man that was casting out devils and doing things in Jesus' name, but he wasn't walking with them. And he said, well, he that isn't against us is for us. And he didn't say, oh, that's obviously he's false. No. So there was this judgment that was very clear that every other church was a false church. And then there was always this stating, and then if not stating, strongly insinuating that salvation must come through the workers' preaching and their baptism. And so exclusivity that fostered an unhealthy wall and barrier with people of false churches and people in the world. People not conforming to the dress code and standards of the home, etc., were often talked about as not being hardy. They weren't hardy in the truth, was a phrase we often heard, because that was the way the church was often referred to, as the church. And so if they didn't follow the dress code, then they weren't so hardy. Or if they didn't get to all the meetings regularly, they weren't hardy. And so, or they were too worldly. And this produced, what does that produce? It produced unnecessary, not godly, what I call weirdness, and was and is a form of control. That's a form of control. And it's not love. That is not love. So, and then, don't question the workers or the fellowship. It started with Christ. And so we were always taught that it started with Christ. Don't question that. Don't question the workers. Don't question this fellowship, this 2x2 way. And in fact, it did start with William Irvin. An inconvenient truth I tried to avoid and deny and minimize along with all my coworkers. But it's kind of freeing now for me just to admit it. Yeah, that it did start with William Irvine. And there's too many historical facts to back that up. And then when inappropriate behavior is addressed by younger workers about older workers to older workers, it does not go well, and had a huge part in CSA and SA, so child sexual abuse and sexual abuse, proliferating in the church. I know this from very personal experiences that led me to becoming more lonely, isolated, and discouraged in the work. It led to depression and horrible panic attacks. I recovered to a point, but ultimately I failed, as I always felt not making it in the work for your whole life, because that was the ideal. Not making it in the work for my whole life was a failure. So then I continued to write her, and I just said this: now I feel complete and settled with my wife, my mate, and best friend. I feel free to love all people without feeling judgment, without feeling that feeling of judgment the church instilled in me from a child. This feels more authentically like the love of Christ that has always and is still so inspiring to me. So, went on to write. I said, these things fostered in me unhealthy attitudes and behaviors. I was judgmental of the world and outsiders and false religions and false preachers, while being fearful to question too much or speak up too much, as when I did, I suffered consequences, as being labeled outspoken and not fitting in enough. The workers that fit in and kept their complaints, questions, fears, doubts to themselves were praised in workers' meetings and in many other subtle and not so subtle ways among us as workers. They were promoted. They are the ones that become overseers. They can be controlled. I know this may sound harsh, but it is the reality I lived and observed for over 25 years. When you are in the work, you do not dare acknowledge those things completely to yourself, as then you could not keep alive the absolute belief that you were in the ministry and the sacrifice of singleness, homelessness, celibacy, not to mention the loneliness, etc., that comes with that, was really worth it. So let me read that sentence again. When you are in the work, you do not dare acknowledge those things completely to yourself, as then you could not keep alive the absolute belief that you were in the ministry and it was worth it then to keep single and to sacrifice of singleness and homelessness and celibacy and the loneliness that all went with that, the deep sense of loneliness. And so I said, I have observed that workers lose the joy and zeal that most of us had when we began. Many, if not most, become depressed, sickly, emotionally, along with many physical health issues, and what I label as deadened. The work becomes a bubble, a prison, and in time it traps you, as if you don't want to leave, where do you go? I mean, if you do want to leave, where do you go? What do? You have nothing. No money, no home, no career, no healthcare, no retirement, no real world experience. I could go on. So you stay and silently suffer. You keep saying all the right things and leaning on the support of the friends to hold you up and assure you that you are doing the right thing. The friends often would say things like, oh, quote, we so appreciate all you have given and sacrificed for the gospel. I heard that many times, or things similar to that. This did not always help. It sometimes could just make us feel more trapped. So why is that? Because all of us continue to struggle with singleness and celibacy, but cannot safely just admit it and talk about it, as inevitably someone will say something that makes you want to shut up, as what they say will insinuate, if not clearly state, that you just need to die to yourself more, you need to have more faith, or you just need to endure like Jesus. This was not love, nor did it feel like love. It caused me to feel more alone. So I just wrote to her, I said, I hope this helps you understand where I'm coming from. I appreciate that you asked me directly. Thanks for listening. And I really did appreciate that. But that sums up a lot of how dysfunctional and upside down, inside out, and insulated in a bubble the 2x2 church is, and the ministry in it. And it's hard. I mean, like I don't like knowing, I mean, some of you watching this may still be in the work, or may still be in the fellowship and not like what I'm saying, or resist it. And I just had this thought this morning that was really inspiring to me, how Jesus overcame the fear of worrying about what men may think. Like in John 1 verse 11, it says he came unto his own and his own received him not. Like he came to the Jews, and he was a Jew, and they didn't receive him, his own people. And it's because they had established all these traditions and made them doctrines, and the way of God was just this burden. And he talks about how so many burdens were put on people, and it was not pretty. And people his own people spoke ill of him and threatened him and criticized him, made false narratives of him, and finally were behind putting him to death, weren't they? And so it is not easy to speak things that even some of your own family members may not like, or reject, or may be uncomfortable with. And there's this fear many of us have about that. And it's like, you know what, we can let go of that fear. It's not easy, but it's kind of like the title of my book. I've thought it might be called The Inconvenient Truth, because the inconvenient truth about what they call the truth is that it's not the truth, and it doesn't set you free. It stifles you and burdens you, and you don't even realize it. It's just little by little by little by little, and then you start to see things that aren't right about it, and this isn't love, and then but what do? There's these fears because I'll be rejected, I'll be misunderstood, I might be spoken against. But you'll be set free. And that's what I feel like now. It's like I just feel free to love like I've never felt free to love, and I love that. And so I'm in graduate school for counseling, and it's really interesting. I just read this in my textbook today, and this textbook is Counseling the Culturally Diverse. And this textbook is a very controversial textbook because it is a very uncomfortable thing to talk about cultural diversity, and to talk about people's biases and their stereotypes, and how we're racist, even when, like, everyone has some element of racism in them, or biases or stereotypes, but it's a very uncomfortable thing to talk about. And so I'm going to just close with, like, why do some people just like, nope, I don't want to face it, I don't want to talk about it? And there's 3 things that I read about in my textbook today when cultural diversity is brought up, and the subject of racism, especially about blacks in America, African Americans in America, and white people. That's kind of the main thing of racism. And so there's cognitive resistance and denial. And I'll just read this. It says, when stories of prejudice and discrimination are told, it directly challenges these cherished beliefs. I thought, wow, that kind of, like, we have these cherished beliefs. And then it says, the student's quote indicates as much when he says that the benign explanations preserve his or her racial reality. So, anyway, that didn't make sense. So just forget that last sentence. But this reality of when people's racism is exposed, like you could hear about African Americans sharing their plight and how life is for them. And I'm a privileged white male American. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And I've been told, no, that's not right. We have to work, but yeah. And so then when a black person says something, a colored person, and then I'm like, I have this narrative of what I deny it, if that makes any sense. So there's cognitive resistance, emotional resistance, and there's behavioral resistance. And so when let me try to sum this up. When we're confronted with things that expose and challenge our cherished beliefs, it's uncomfortable, and we have these emotional responses and behavioral resistance, emotional resistance, cognitive resistance, and fear then is a powerful emotion in this. And it says it's a frightening prospect because I do not want to see the possibility that I have been a racist, or you could say that I have seen things wrong. And awareness is scary. That's what it says here. Fear, uncomfortable, anger, guilt, defensiveness, helplessness. These are all things people have expressed when they start opening their eyes and learning about cultural diversity and the realities and listening to people of different cultures and races of them and putting aside their narrative about it, right? And then it's like one person wrote, the student said, I hate to feel this way. It's scary. But then you know what happens is, let's say you have a colored person and a white person, and finally they just listen to each other and they work through those scary feelings. And they're open to a different narrative that their cherished belief, the narrative that their cherished belief holds. You know what happens then? You start connecting. You start feeling free. You don't feel this fear of people or this judgment or these walls or these barriers. And it's beautiful. Anyway, I could go on about all this, but I'll leave this for now. Thanks for listening, and I'll continue doing these. So continue to let love lead. That's my focus. And like I say, let's roll that way.